And one thing that we learned when we were behaving like expert systems improvers is that it's one thing to specify the way a system ought to change and the way it needs to be, and even to quote the people on the way it ought to change and needs to be. It's quite another thing to line up the tens or 20s or hundreds or thousands of people whose hearts have to come along with their heads if there's going to be any change in the system. That was a huge dilemma for us. So in our consulting practice in the 1970s and in the 1980s, when we went to Bethlehem Steel, for example, we had at our fingertips an understanding of expert problem solving. We had an understanding of group problem solving, of getting everybody involved in solving the problems of the system. And we were beginning to have an understanding of the systemic issues related to the labor management problem in Bethlehem Steel, that it was connected to technology, it was connected to capital investment. It wasn't just a human resources issue, it was a systemic issue with historic roots. We had all that at our fingertips, but we began to see that unless we could involve everybody in the system in thinking about how to improve the whole, we were not going to succeed in our objective in creating better relationships between labor and management, in helping people to have more satisfying work, in bringing dignity, meaning, and community to the workplace, which is where people spend at least a third of their lives. So it was in that context that I began I guess at the time of Bethlehem Steel, in the early 1980s, to think about how do we involve everybody in improving the whole system. And in the 1987 book, I wrote about the only two methods that I really had known and practiced up to that time that I believed would be appropriate. One was the redesign of work systems, was the involving of people in the redesign of the entire work system, of the whole factory or the whole office, using what we were calling in those days socio-technical principles or socio-technical techniques. In other words, treating the social and technological systems as a single interrelated system. And you could easily add economics into that fix, and you could add politics if you wish, but the whole idea was to treat the system as a whole and to involve all the people who worked in that system in documenting it. So we would do this. This is a typical exercise that I was doing in the early 1980s with my clients. They have a problem on their filling line in the factory. This is a factory making pain relievers. And nobody knows how to solve the problem. We say, okay, let's get all the people who are connected to the filling line into the room. So we get the people who are involved in the packaging. We get the people who are involved in running the machines. We get the supervisors. We get the safety inspectors. We get them all in the room. And we say, let's make a chart on the wall here of everything that has to happen for this system to improve based on your own experience. So they start to make a chart. And then they get to a point where you say, what happens next? And the people say, well, I don't know what happens next. Well, then we say, well, I don't know where that problem came from. Well, who knows? They start thinking about who knows. We stop the action. We literally take a break for half an hour while they go find the people who know. And we bring them into the room and say, now you add your piece to the puzzle. Well, this is what it means to have people redesign their own work systems. And eventually it gets into more complexity. Do we need supervisors or don't they? What are the jobs that supervisors did that the people themselves could actually do? To what extent can people be accountable and responsible for their own work? To what extent can they add to their skill base so that they create more flexibility in the system? Those were all the kind of questions that redesign of work involved. Well, this is now a refinement of Taylorism and a refinement of expert systems thinking, because we're involving everybody in the design of systems. But the systems we're talking about are very concrete systems. Office technologies, factory technologies. There is still a whole other level of work, which I think OD consultants tend to deal with more than they deal with these other matters these days. And that's the whole concept of business strategy and alignment. The entire globalization business, where industries and NGOs are now working everywhere in the world simultaneously has raised a whole new sets of problems which don't entirely have technological solutions, although a number of us are working on those. And so I was talking in the 80s about the only other method that I knew for getting everybody improved whole systems, and that's what we came to call future search. I think this is an interesting aside, but it's relevant in this context because Ron Lippitt is one of, along with Eric Trist and Fred Emery, Ron Lippitt and his collaborator Eva Schindler-Rainman were the people who opened the door to a new kind of practice that took us away from Taylorism, took us away from expert problem solving and even expert systems improving in the direction of getting everybody improving the whole. And Ron started very early in the game. He helped, along with Kurt Lewin, he named the field of group dynamics in the late 1930s. And it was he who did a lot of the work to create group problem solving as a methodology. But in the 1950s, he began having his students listen to audio tapes of strategic planning groups doing group problem solving as they made their plans. And he discovered that as they made these plans, their voices became more labored. And it became difficult as they laid out all of the problems in the system. And then they tried to solve each of these problems piecemeal. You could almost hear the anxiety rise in the room on these tapes. And Ron came to an interesting conclusion. He concluded in the mid-1950s that group problem solving was depressing people. And he wanted to energize people. So he started experimenting with what he called images of potential. Instead of saying, what's wrong and how do we fix it, he began to ask the question, what is the possibility here and who cares? Who's excited about new possibilities? And it was that whole understanding in the 50s which he brought to bear to these large group conferences that he began to do in the 1970s with a community development consultant named Eva Schindler-Rainman. And the two of them discovered, in working with 88 cities and towns and other organizations with as many as 300 people in the room at a time, that if they could get a cross-section of the entire community into the room at once for a day or two, that was the most time they ever had. They never had more than 2 days, but it was for a day or two. And if they would set them working on their images of potential for that community, they could help people to make changes that they had not dreamed were possible before. That was a momentous discovery, and it was that discovery that I began to try to build on, starting with Bethlehem Steel and with my clients later. Increasingly, we were bringing more and more people into the room to look at more and more of the system, because the more people you bring into the room from the more parts of the system, the more access everybody has to information that no one of them has. So when you can get everybody to access the information that all the people in a system have that no one else has, everybody knows more about a system in a day or two than any one person knew when they were going in. And when that happens, it becomes possible to solve problems at a level that they have never been solved before, and to make strategic plans that people never dreamed were possible before.